This will be the most in-depth tutorial on the internet for the GBA. Well, for modding the GBA, specifically with the IPS v2 kit. But after watching this video, you should be able to tackle any GBA IPS mod, pretty much any Game Boy IPS mod there is. If you are a beginner, if you've never even touched or seen a soldering iron in real life before, you should be able to complete this mod by the end of this video, or at least you'll have the knowledge to be able to do it very easily. I promise it's not as hard or scary as it may seem. I'm here to try and help you. I'm going to try to not leave any information out, but if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. We're going to start by going over what you need to complete this: a Game Boy and the mod kit. You don't need to buy a shell, but I recommend it because trimming is crappy. I did a video recently about trimming a GBA shell for a different IPS mod, but it's not fun. There is a drop-in version if you'd rather do that. I have a video on the main channel all about that kit, but this is still the best kit in my opinion. I also like the laminated V5. The laminated V5, you will need to trim the original shell if you get that and you want to use an original shell. But the non-laminated version, you can just drop right in. None of these kits require soldering. You don't need to solder with this, but I highly recommend that you do try it because button controls are very nice. For most Game Boy mods, if you don't solder, you're either stuck with touch controls or, in this case, no controls. You will be stuck at the middle brightness level, which is a good amount of brightness. It's not too bright, it's not too dark. That's why it's in the middle. But having the ability to control the brightness levels is really good. There are a few that don't require soldering, like the drop-in V5, the laminated V5. Those have touchpads. Those I recommend, but I still think this is the better one. That's why I'm going to go over this specifically. No matter what kit you're using, this tutorial will help you as a beginner. I recommend getting a shell that is meant for the V2 because that way you don't have to do any trimming. If you want to use your original shell, get a drop-in kit. And if you want a laminated kit, get the laminated kit. We're focusing on the V2, and this is a V2 ready shell. If you're confused already, which I'm confused myself, I have a video going over the differences in all of the Game Boy Advance shells because that is really confusing in itself. But usually when you get a shell like this, at least with a design on it, it'll come with buttons. Most of them come with just like the plain gray buttons. This one comes with the orange plastic buttons and the orange rubber membranes. Really, the only tool you absolutely need is a screwdriver or a couple screwdrivers. I have the iFixit Protect toolkit. I highly recommend it because it's got all of these bits. I don't know which bits they have in the smaller kits, but the things you will need are a tri-wing or a Y bit, specifically the Y0 bit, and you will need a Phillips 1. Now, technically these screws are not Phillips heads. Technically, they're JIS. The J bit, the J1, which is also in the Protect toolkit. People say, don't use the Phillips, it'll break it, it'll strip it. If you're not careful, usually it's just if you don't have the right size. So it's still one, it is slightly different. But if you don't get any of the screwdrivers included with your kit, which most of them do, you'll get a crappy tri-wing and Phillips head. Those will work fine. A Phillips head works in a pinch. It really, really does not matter. I promise you it doesn't. Just be careful. But these are the only two bits that we'll need. And a screwdriver handle is probably nice. But you should have some included with your kit. I get them all the time. I've had hundreds and hundreds of pairs come through here. I always throw them out because I don't need them. Pretty much everything else is optional, but I highly recommend it. A soldering iron. You don't have to get a fancy one like mine. I've got a starter kit that comes with a lot of extra things that are helpful for this kind of stuff. I'll link it down below. I believe it's about 25 bucks. A mod mat is nice. I've used this same mod mat since I started with all this stuff. I believe this was about 20 bucks. They come in all different shapes and sizes. They're all pretty much the same. But as long as you're not like putting the soldering iron through your table, you don't really need one of these. If you're just going to do one mod, I think it's fine to go without it. But if you're going to be doing a lot of this stuff, I would definitely invest in a mod mat. As well as flux. Absolutely love flux. I use probably too much flux. I don't think there's such thing is too much flux. But I recommend using flux. I'll link this down below. I have multiple different kinds of flux, and obviously you'll need solder, but you don't need flux because if you get rosin core solder, the rosin core means that there is flux in it. But for beginners and really people of all skill levels, flux is extremely helpful. Just having more flux than what's in the solder, it's very nice. But I will show you the techniques that I use, so hopefully you won't need any flux. If you're trying to do this on a budget, I totally understand. So I will try my best to get you to not need flux, but this is like $7-8, I think. It's really cheap and really worth it. You don't need a whole roll, but paper towels are nice because I highly recommend using isopropyl alcohol. You probably have some of this lying around, maybe not in a spray bottle, but 70% is fine. 91% is even better. I use 99%. It will dry the fastest. All of them are good at cleaning. They're all exceptional. But the lower the percent, the slower it's going to dry. And you don't want to button this up or turn it on until it's dry. You use isopropyl alcohol because it's a good cleaner that is safe for electronics. But even with 99%, there's still 1% water in here. Or maybe less than 1% of water because there might be other things in here. I don't know. I also like using a toothbrush. These I get in packs of 2 for $1, sometimes less from Target. Just their in-house brand. They work fine. Or you can steal your dog's toothbrush. That works too. And later on, I'll talk about this more, but a fiberglass pen is also another tool that I really like to use. I use it all the time. It's helpful for cleaning stuff that's on the board, but again, we'll go over that later. And flush cutters. I forgot. It's kind of necessary, kind of not. Depends on the shell you get. You should always watch tutorials in full before you start them. And lastly, this is not necessary at all, but I love this flux remover. I recently picked this up and I cannot get enough of it. It's super helpful with getting rid of extra flux. It's not necessary unless you're going to be doing a lot of work like me. Plus, the flux that I recommend is no clean flux, which means you don't have to clean it, but it's still sticky, it's tacky, it's kind of gross. I just don't like leaving it there. So I typically clean it up. But yeah, I think that is all the tools you'll need for cleaning your soldering iron. If you don't want to buy one of these things, which is not necessary unless you're going to do this a bunch, you can just use a sponge, a wet sponge, and wipe it off. The solder will come off onto the sponge. And a lot of soldering irons will come with a little sponge that's usually completely dried out. But I think that is actually it. Goodness gracious. I usually don't go over tools because this stuff happens, but I'm only including this because this is the extended cut of the in-depth tutorial. So let's actually open up the Game Boy. 15 minutes later, there are 6 tri-wing screws on the Game Boy Advance. And I'm gonna move this stuff out of the way. I have an extra screen lens here because sometimes the shells don't come with the right screen lens cut out. This does not come with the right screen lens cut out, which doesn't make sense because it's a shell for the V2 kits, but it doesn't fit. I don't get it. And also, since I have like a million of these shells, I don't remember if this has the screws in the plastic bag or not. I buy them in bulk, so they kind of separate all that stuff. That's why I have a separate bag for that, as well as the sticker, but that should all come with yours in one bag, especially if you buy it from a retailer. I should also mention that all of the stuff that I have mentioned is in a link in the description, and I probably will make commissions off of it, not all of it. You can use code Jake to save some money at Retro Game Repair Shop, Retro Modding, those kinds of stores. If there's a code spot, try code Jake. Might work, and it'll give me a kickback. So you save money, I make money. It's awesome. And now we can flip over to our Phillips head. Again, JIS, doesn't really matter, just be careful. And we're gonna be taking out this screw right here. It is usually black, a little hard to miss, and it's really tight for some reason. Now, I'm not gonna be reusing the screws. The only time I really reuse screws is if I'm doing an SP mod, because those are better screws than the originals, but the aftermarket screws are pretty good for most other mods. Really depends on the quality of the shell, but the one I'm using today is good, so I'm just leaving all of the screws in their spots. That way I don't have to deal with them. But we can put that back half off to the side for now. And in here, I actually do have 3 Phillips screws. Not all of them will have all 3 Phillips screws in there. I don't know why they did that, but usually you'll only see 2 in here. This one's pretty much always there, but one of these 2 might be missing for you. It's fine. It's okay. The replacement screws have 3 for the motherboard. But before we get there, we're going to take our thumbs like this, put our fingernails underneath the latch, and push up. If we push up at the same time, both sides should go up and we won't have a teeter-totter going on. Then we can stick our tweezers in there and pull up. Careful not to puncture your ribbon cable with the pointy tweezers. You can also use your screwdriver if you don't have any tweezers. Anything small, just make sure if it's not coming out, don't force it out. You probably just don't have the latch up enough. And from there, we can take these 3 Phillips screws out. They're the same size as the black screw. If you want to organize them off to the side, you can, but it's not really necessary because we have the other screws in our new kit. If you're reusing the screws, then you should probably organize them, but all 3 of these are the same. It shouldn't matter if you mix them up. From here, I like to grab it by the cart slot and just pull up. Some of the buttons might fall off. Some of the membranes might stick to the board. It's all good. We can put this off to the side and remove the membranes if they're stuck to it, and just put all of that off to the side. If you're going to reuse your shell, you can take this and twist gently just to loosen that up. And you can get your fingernail in there and pull up and rip that out. And you can also rip the old tape out. And then you can do your necessary trimming. You can push the screen lens out. Okay, that kind of worked. Now you can effectively do your trimming if you need to, but it's not fun. I don't recommend trimming. I also recommend probably cleaning everything before you do the trimming. You can soak all the plastic and membranes in some hot soapy water, brush them up with a toothbrush, get them nice and dry, and then you can come back and mod this. But with everything else off to the side, we can look at the motherboard. And scanning around, oh, there's actually some corrosion over here. How did I miss that before? Well, that's perfect because I was about to say, do anything that you need to fix your Game Boy now. If it's dirty, I recommend spraying some isopropyl alcohol on it, using your toothbrush to lightly clean everything up. But I've already done that to this thing. I clean and fix everything that I need to beforehand. Obviously, it's not super corroded, but apparently it was fine enough to power on and miss my first go around. I'm going to go ahead and remove this quickly and swap it out. No need to have that in this video, but I also recommend cleaning up your power switch. This is something that I've definitely done. You can see a little bit of remaining flux there, but I've shown off how to clean power switches in multiple different videos and shorts. I will link at least one short down below. It's not that hard, but you do have to solder, but it will keep your Game Boy running for a long time. It'll keep it clean for another 20 years or so. I highly recommend cleaning it out because it's probably gross. But I'm going to do a time lapse of me swapping this out real quick. It shouldn't take very long. It's not necessary for this video. Now that that's done, again, fix anything that you need to. At the very least, I highly recommend cleaning up the gold pads for all of your buttons. That way you'll have better accuracy when you actually press your buttons, or you won't have to like jam down on B just to get it to go. If there's any dark spots, smudges, whatever, I would take a paper towel, some IPA, spray it on there until they're nice and shiny, or as shiny as you can get them. If they're being really stubborn, that's where I get out these guys, the fiberglass pens, and I'll just rub them on there. You really only want to use them when it's absolutely necessary, because this can and will damage your buttons and anything if you do it too much or too hard, unless you're having some serious trouble or it's like really gross and obviously visibly gross. Use this as a last resort. I mean, really the last resort is like the metal brush, which will clean that up even easier, but will also scratch everything in its way. And this is like the number one tool I use to clean out the gunk in the power switches. So I really do recommend this stuff. It's really good, but you just don't want to go overboard with it. Now that our Game Boy Advance is fully cleaned, fixed, and ready to go, we can get to the modding portion, which will actually include me putting that off to the side and getting out our mod kit. Now's the time to take everything out of its plastic bags. Maybe I should have put scissors as a requirement for this. Sometimes these companies just go overboard with tape. Again, this particular lens that was included is not cut for the IPS V2. I believe this is cut for an original display or a drop-in display, so we're ignoring that one. Here are the rest of our buttons. Some of them are already included, or installed, I should say. And then the rest of our membranes. I'm gonna go ahead and just remove the side pieces in L and R because they're gonna get in our way anyways. And then I'm just gonna dump the screws and the light pipe right there. And that is all of the ridiculous amount of plastic bags that they include. It is overkill. It is ridiculous. It's annoying. But we have all of our stuff unpacked so we can go over it. You should have at least 3 wires. Most GBA kits will come with these 3 wires. One for L, one for R, and one for select. You should also get these things. This is for if you trim your IPS kit, but we're actually going to use these because I like these. Well, at least the thinner one we're going to use. You've got your ribbon cable. This is the most important and most expensive part of this entire kit. Do not hurt this thing. Here is our screen that we will connect this to later, the insulating film, the foam, and the double-sided tape that we'll use in just a bit. I'm going to put most of this off to the side. We can go ahead and install this real quick because you can really do this at any point. But I'm going to try and line it up in the corner where the connector is. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I don't like it to stick out too much. It can kind of get in the way when we're putting it in the shell. And we're not going to connect this immediately. We're going to do the soldering first. If you don't want to do the soldering, that's okay. But at least watch the soldering portion to see how easy it really is. Then you can make your decision because honestly, I believe in you. I think you can do it. We are going to put this off to the side and we're going to leave this out. And I'm specifically placing it down like this with the connector part over here and all of our writing is upside down. We can now get our soldering irons out. I'm plugging mine in and I'm going to turn it to 300 degrees Celsius. I'm using lead-free solder. That has a higher melting temperature. I don't like using lead solder because everything I've ever heard about lead is not good. You should have good airflow in the room you're in. If you have an air purifier, you can turn that on. It's not super necessary because we are going to be using very minimal solder. Just don't get the smoke directly into your lungs and you'll be fine, I promise. But that's not medical advice, legally speaking. Don't listen to me at all, ever. My soldering iron is now at 300 degrees Celsius. Yours might not be as fancy as to tell you exactly what the temperature is. That's okay. Let it heat up for like a minute. It doesn't take that long to heat it up. We are going to put the soldering iron on the L pad on the gold part. And when we do this, I'm going to only hold it there for like a second before we start pushing the solder in, and then we lift up. It's that fast, it's that simple, it's that easy. Now, if you do not want to use flux, if you do not want to buy it because this is the only project you're going to do with soldering, you're done after this, I get it, it's fine. You're probably going to want to clean your iron's tip after every time you add solder. So I'll do that with you. If you have a sponge, wet it and wipe it off until it's nice and clean. Get all the excess solder off. Then we're going to do that again to the R pad. We're going to place it down. We're going to stick the solder in, and then we're going to lift up. That was not as clean of a go, so we can put it down, lift it up. Not that great. We didn't put too much solder on here, so we can stick the iron back down, push a little bit more in, and lift up. It's a little cleaner. Either way, it's fine. You just don't want too much on your iron or on the pad, because when we go to do the last one, we don't want any bridging to occur. So again, cleaning it up, and then we do the same process again. Stick it down, stick it in, and lift up. We got 2 out of 3 perfect solder balls there. Nothing's bridging, everything's good. Now, yes, cleaning the tip after every single attempt is overkill. That's why I like flux. That way, if you do add too much solder, or if you're accidentally bridging something somehow, you can take your flux and we're going to clean up the R pad here. Even though it's not necessary, it's totally fine. That's perfectly acceptable. We can just touch it down and flux is going to make it perfect. Like, we can try and bridge those. Flux is going to keep that from doing anything. Let's see. Flux doesn't even want me to try and bridge it. But yeah, flux is nice. Maybe I can give a better example of why flux is so awesome in a later part of this video, but I highly recommend flux. I mean, flux is the reason why all 3 of those are still looking perfect, even though I was meddling. Now I would recommend wiping your tip clean because you probably have a little too much solder on your tip. But it's also fine if you do leave a little bit on here because our next step is adding the wires. So we've got L, R, and select. And L is for the left button, right? So we're going to stick the wire out to the left. No, this is upside down. So I'm going to stick the wire out to the right side, and we're going to solder this to the L pad here. Beautiful. The next wire is for R, so we're going to stick that out to the left and solder that down to R. And then we're going to take select and stick that out to the left as well. You'll see why in a bit, and solder that down as well. When I say solder that down, all I'm doing is touching the tip to the part I want to connect the wire to. All of these look decent. There's no bridging occurring. Everything looks pretty good. They're connected, and if you give it the pull test and they're not coming off, don't yank them, but just a light pull. Make sure they're connected and they stay. You're good. Do not pull too hard. That would be very bad. But I'm going to unplug my soldering iron for now, and we'll get back to the soldering in a little bit. We can lift that up. There's a little bit of flux on my mat, and I'm going to clean this up since we're about to put the shell down and I don't want to get any flux on my shell. If you're really wanting to keep your shell clean, which is very understandable, you can take out a new paper towel and put everything on top of it. I have it clean enough for now, so I'm just going to put this down directly on the mod mat. We're going to need to snip this piece right here. This is here for a drop-in display, so it's all even without needing any extra stuff done to it. But we're going to flush cut this piece right here for our V2 kit. That's it. You could also use a craft knife if you need to, but it's going to be easier with flush cutters. But I feel like most people have some sort of razor blade in their home, and that'll work just fine. I am also going to cut the one on the other side too, because this isn't always the most accurate because shells are weird. The bottom side, that one's fine. We don't need to mess with it, but you can cut it if you want to. If your shell has 3 notches on the left side and no notch on the right side, you don't have to do anything. If there's a notch on the right side and you're using the V2 kit, you need to cut everything off the right side. Cool. We are going to take our double-sided tape. We're going to peel the yellow side first, or whatever side has the cutouts on the left. I guess it'll be right over here because we want these cutouts, even though we just flush cut away one of our cutouts. We are going to drop that down on that side and make sure it's close to the top as well, and stick that down everywhere we can. Run your finger along it just to make sure it's stuck down, and then we can punch it through the other side. And we don't need this. Now we can take our tweezers or your fingernail. Mine aren't really that long, so I'm using the tweezers. We can peel up the rest. And the reason why we cut that one off is because I like to use the guide that's included. This makes it easier because instead of one tiny little point, it's going to give us a full guide on that left side. So hopefully it won't be twisted when we install it. So I'm going to stick it with either of the brown sides up, all the way up against the top there and all the way up against the left side, and stick that down. You don't need to peel the brown pieces because you're not going to see it. That's all we need to do for now. If you were using an original shell, you would do the same thing, putting that there, and then this would go in the bottom piece. I don't think anybody's actually trimming and following along with this. So we're going to put that shell off to the side for now. We're going to get our screen back out and orient it this way. We can stick the ribbon cable down like this. And we're going to connect the two finally. This is really hard to capture because it's so small, but I'm trying my best here. We're going to take the connector and fold it over, and it fits in just like a puzzle piece. Some might even call it a Lego connector. I don't know if that's the actual term or not. Shout out to my mate Vince. But make sure it's nice and locked in there. Don't put too much pressure, but obviously you want that locked in. Then from here, I like to get the screen lens out. We can peel the outer part. Then I like to try and peel just the tape part and the first layer. And then we just have this loose piece, and it's really loose for us here, which is good. But if it's not easily coming out like mine just did, using your thumbs to do a pinching motion will bring this up like so, and then it'll be easy to touch without getting your grubby little fingerprints on the glass. Then we'll carefully grab it from the other sides. If you have some canned air and you're like really worried about dust, you can spray that. But for this part, we don't really need to worry about dust because we'll be getting in and out of it for a couple more minutes. And it should just line up with your shell. There might be a little bit of gaps. Don't worry too much about it. Mine looks fairly good. I am out of canned air, unfortunately, so hopefully we won't get too much dust in here. We're going to act quickly so we don't get too much dust in here. You can take the green little tab, peel that back, and then we can take it, still grabbing it by the sides, put it in the top left corner up against our guide, as far left and as far up as possible, and drop that down. It should be pretty close along that right side, and we can lightly press everything down just a bit. Oh, and that sucks. Unfortunately, the select plastic got in the way, and so our ribbon cable came out. This is why we install it first, because it's really hard to connect the connector, when the screen is stuck down in the shell. So I'm going to try and attempt that again. That didn't have a good click like the first time, so this might just be a black screen when we turn it on. But you don't always need a perfect click when you connect that connector. Either way, we are connected and hopefully fingerprintless on the screen, hopefully dustless as well, but don't get your hopes up. From here, we can put the whole assembly down here, and we can get our motherboard back out, and I like to place it down like this. We're going to solder the select wire right now, so getting our soldering irons back out. Once again, we will put the tip on the spot we're going to solder to, push the solder in, and then lift up. I forgot to mention that we're soldering to TP2. There won't be as much solder that sticks to this spot. It's a little smaller. You'll only see a little bit of solder, but that's plenty. We can take our select wire and make sure it's the select wire, hold it up over there, press our soldering iron down, and we should be good. Now here's where you want to be careful and look at your soldering job once you're done. Everything looks good over here. I did accidentally add a little bit of solder to this via right here. That's totally fine. As long as your wire isn't extending to any of these other points anywhere around TP2, you're good. It's very common for the wire to get extended past the TP2 spot, and so you might accidentally bridge either of these 2 points, maybe the capacitor or the resistor, and that will cause your button to either not work, always be pressed down, make start press when selects press, all of that stuff. Essentially what I'm trying to say is it's not good, but it's not the end of the world. You can fix it. It's fine. That's where flux can come in handy, putting some flux down, reflowing the solder, and just make sure the wire is only touching TP2. It's like the most common thing I see with modding and beginners. It's something that happens to me on a regular basis when I'm not careful. I mean, it doesn't happen to me like every day, but it still happens to me. Accidents happen. It's okay. And as long as you aren't holding your soldering iron down for too long, you're not going to have any burnt pads. You can easily just rip off those gold pads. You don't need to hold it for more than like 2 or 3 seconds. So if something's not going right, if the solder isn't adhering right, or there's something going wrong, just lift it up every few seconds. Don't get it too hot. Don't force anything. It should be easy. So if it's not easy, you might be doing something wrong. Just take a second, step back, then get back to it. And flux is always your friend. But as long as your wire is all good, we can do a little tiny pull test. See how I'm barely pulling on that? I'm not yanking it. Just a little pull. It's not going anywhere. We're good. From here, some people like to solder to the test pads for L and R. I don't like to do that. Especially for R, there's a lot of stuff in this area that can cause it to short to ground. That's not good, because if you short this wire to ground, it's connected to R, so then R will always be pressed down. And normally what happens when you solder to the test pad for R is it either gets stuck in the hole over here and it gets pinched on one of these components. It's just not fun. It's a lot easier to do it my way, so I'll show you that in a minute. L's a different story, so if you really want to do all your soldering here, you would need to solder to TP9 for L and TP8 for R. But from here, we can go ahead and put all of our buttons in. D-pad can go in any of the 4 ways. Just make sure that this nub is up. We go A on the outside, B on the inside. They only go in one way. You can put your start and select membrane in there. There are no hard plastic buttons for that, unless you're using an extreme rate shell, which I do prefer the hard button start and select. extreme rate shells are kind of the reason why I'm redoing this in-depth tutorial in the first place. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just a slightly different way of doing it. We can put our D-pad membrane down. It only goes in one way. And this also only goes in one way for the A and B buttons. Now, there is some leftover plastic here. I just like to put the power switch, the side posts, which this part that sticks out is on our right side right now. It'll be on the left when it's all closed up and facing us properly. And then we've got L and R. Some of you might have the metal tabs already inserted. Some of you, like me, will have to insert them yourselves. I don't think it really matters which way the metal faces. I never think about it. There's just a little slot at the edge on the inside, and we can just push that in there as far as you can. Do it to both of them. Slots in there nicely. Sometimes they can be a little bit of a pain, but that's fine. And again, we're upside down, so L and R will be on the opposite sides. Not sticking them in the shell because they will get in our way. And I'm cutting in here again because I've done something that I normally forget. It's a bit of a meme on the channel. I forgot the light pipe. So before you fold this all up together, which you'll see in a second how annoying it can be, you want to take your light pipe and you want to put that in right there. It is always going to be in this top left corner. There's a couple of holes. Some of these are screw posts, but it's the one that's right above this screw post here. There are 2 notches. You can flip it either way. It does not matter, but you're going to want to stick that in. It's not the end of the world if you do forget it and you don't want to go back in, but it does diffuse the light from the power light a lot better. From here, we're going to look at our Game Boy Advance board, and there is a little number right here. Mine says 32. Yours might say 40. It's going to be either 32 or 40. That means how many pins are on the ribbon connector. And over here, you might be able to see that we have 2 connectors here. This is the 32 pin. This is the 40 pin. If your number is 40 on your board, you're going to use this one. You'll eventually flip this over and stick the ribbon cable in like this, pins up. But if you're like me and you're doing a 32 pin, we're going to take the 40 pin and we're going to fold it over with a light crease, not a hard crease, just in case you ever need it for some reason. I don't know why you would. And then we're going to take the 32 pin and definitely don't hard crease this, but fold it over even lighter of a crease. You don't want to crease at all, but make sure that it wants to go that way a little bit at least. This is the harder version for this. Other kits will have separate ribbon cables, which is nice. But we're also going to take the L and R wires that we've got and stick them up and out through this way, still having one of them go to the left and one of them go to the right. And the L will go to the right, the R will go to the left. Then we're going to stick our 32 pin over the top of it. We're actually going to loop the select wire underneath it. This is where it's going to get a little hard to do. We're going to put our foam on top of all of that, and then we're going to stick our board down, make sure the wire for select doesn't get anywhere over any of the buttons. And then we can try to put all of this down like so. We can lift up our entire assembly. That'll make it a little easier because the buttons will prevent it from fully going down. Make sure your wires are still sticking through in the same spot as the ribbon cable. But keeping this pinched, now that I have my light pipe installed, we're going to find our 3 Phillips screws that are silver and shorter. Some of your kits might have all Phillips screws for the aftermarket ones. Those are typically the cheaper screws. So if you have all Phillips screws, even though it might be easier to get into in the future, I recommend reusing your older original screws. But mine are nice and shiny silver, and I've got 3 small Phillips screws as well as a black Phillips screw. This is for the outside. The rest of these should be tri-wing screws. I'm going to take the Phillips and I'm going to stick it in those 3 holes. They are designated by the circles around them on the motherboard, and we're just going to screw them down. Try not to over tighten it. If you over tighten it, you could break a screw post. That would not be fun. I've done that plenty of times before. And you don't have to do all 3, but it's nice. And again, don't over tighten them, but I do like to make them tight-ish. And then I back it off about a quarter turn. Backing off all 3 of them about a quarter turn will ensure that your buttons are easier to press. The membranes won't be as stiff, and your Game Boy will actually sense your button presses better. So now that we've got it all locked down, the rest of this should be a little bit easier to handle. Whether you have a 32 or 40 pin connector, we're going to take our ribbon cable. It might need to be pulled up a little bit. Don't pull it too far, but have it about this far extended. Then we can fold it back over and stick it in gold pins up. It should look like this. Some of those gold pins will still be sticking up. It won't fully be hidden. Then we can do the reverse of what we did earlier when we undid it. Just close those down at the same time until they're nice and flat. Then your ribbon cable will be locked in. If you're not soldering, then you can pretty much button this up. But for those of us who are soldering and who didn't use the test pads for LNR, this is the way I recommend to do it. For the last time, we can turn on our soldering iron, and no matter which one you're working on, this is not mirrored. It will be the same pin on both sides. We will be soldering to the second pin to the left. That is this one right there, right next to SW2. We are going to heat up that pin, get the solder flowing. We are going to stick our wire in there and lift up. That is pretty much 20-year-old solder. So I didn't get the best soldering job. Actually, that's totally acceptable. But if you're struggling, you can put a little bit of flux down. That should help a little bit, and it cleans up that joint a little nicer. I like to wrap the wire around these two capacitors. Your wire might not be long enough. Obviously, don't try and yank it, but it just keeps it a little nicer. Some people have said, oh, isn't that going to rip the capacitors off? No. Once this is closed up, that wire is not going to move. So don't worry about it. As long as it's not like super tight and pulling on the capacitors, which it's not, there's nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, on this side, we don't have anything to really wrap around. But again, we are still soldering to the second pin from the left. It is not mirrored. It is the same. So we can take our wire. We can heat up that pin. We can stick our wire into the melting solder. We can lift up. That was a really good joint. Given a little pull test, we're still good. I didn't give a pull test to the other side, but we're good over there too. And for me, I'm done. I can clean my soldering iron tip and put it away. Again, if it's not going right, if you may have accidentally bridged something, use some flux. It'll be helpful. Now, to keep the left wire in check, I like to make sure that the wire is going between these two holes here. We do not want them over either of those, because that will make it pinch and short it to ground, and then your R will always be pressed down. So I keep my finger here, and then I shove the rest of the wire underneath the cart slot, and then that should lock it in right there. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but there is space underneath the cart slot. It's not going to get in the way of your carts, your games, whatever. There's just a gap underneath there for some reason. And again, just make sure there's plenty of space. It's like even between these two holes. Then we can set this down. We can put our power switch in. We can put the right and left side plastic pieces on. That cutout is here on the board, so it'll fit in like a puzzle piece. And then left will go in on the right side because we're upside down, and right on the left side. These metal pins go through, and then there is a hole for these plastic pins to rest in. So then you get that springy action. It can be a little hard to find the right spot sometimes for this. Again, just don't force it. If it's not going well, you're probably not doing it right. But you can always test the button by holding it down here and seeing if it springs back to life before you close it up. And if it does, you're good. And we're good here. We're almost done. We can take the back half of the shell. We can take off the battery cover, and we can stick it down like so. It can be a little hard to line up your positive and negative battery terminals into the slots on the back half of the shell, but you can line that up and stick it down. We can take that black Phillips head screw and we can screw that down. Make sure everything is flat. I like to keep my hand pressured up against this. Then we can swap to our tri-wing bit, still keeping that pressure down because we don't want it to lift up and get misaligned. If we screw it down when it's misaligned, the shell will get cracked, and we don't want that. Then I like to do either of these very top two screws for the tri-wing. Screw it down a bit, go to the other side, do that one. And I don't like to relieve the pressure from my hand until I get at least one of these bottom ones down. But we're not using like a ton of pressure, so it's really not a big deal if you just leave it there the whole time. And it looks like they included an extra small Phillips screw. That's a motherboard screw, so I'm going to leave that over there. And then we can put the last 2 screws down in here and over here. And you can make sure all of your screws are tight. Don't over tighten them. You don't want to have a broken screw post, so just don't over tighten it. And if you're having trouble with button presses, it's a little stiff, it feels a little too tight maybe, you can always back those off like a quarter to a half an inch. You can always back those off a quarter or a half a turn, and it should still be fine. Sometimes if these top 4 screws are too tight, the L and R buttons won't spring back well. Sometimes that's just due to a shell not being the best, or those metal pieces we put in the L and R buttons aren't doing their job properly. From here, we can do pretty much the last step and put our batteries in. Put the battery cover on for good luck, and then we can turn it on. Beautiful. Everything looks centered, nothing looks crooked. I'm not really seeing any dust or fingerprints, but I haven't peeled this back yet. I don't think I'm going to peel it back, not until I start doing B-roll or something. But if we did it right, we should be able to hold select and press L to lower the brightness, and then we press R to raise the brightness. I know it's not really helpful, but the brightness that we turned it on to is the brightness that you will be stuck with if you don't do the soldering. For the V2, there is no fancy special menu. There's no frame blending, but this is the brightest kit. It is the most battery efficient kit, and that's why I love it. There aren't many games that need frame blending. None of the games that I really played need frame blending, so I don't worry about it. So that's why this is still my go-to kit, but the V5 is my other go-to kit if you want a laminated screen and if you want frame blending. But this is the brightest kit by far, and it's got the most range. It's just really the best overall. Go watch my comparison video. In that one, I tell you, I'm not going to tell you which one I like. This is the one I like the most. That's really it. We can test with the button tester, and then we can put our sticker on. This is special from Natalie the Nerd. And oh, look, you should subscribe. For me, I get in with A and B. A, B, right, left, down, up, start, select, R, and L. Everything is working beautifully. And if it hasn't sold for some reason, I'm recording this like a month or more in advance, so this probably is sold. But if it hasn't sold and you've watched this entire video, the extended cut, the main channel video, and you're like, man, as much as I want this, I still don't want to put in the work. I don't want to get a soldering iron. That's totally understandable. You can buy this or any others like it from my website, retroremaster.com. I sell all the Game Boy models modded except for the micro, because there's really no point in modding a micro. And I even sell modded GameCubes. All of those at the link in the description. Even if this one is sold by the time you're watching this, this is one of those that will always come back in stock eventually. So just hang around, subscribe, maybe follow my Instagram because I post those there too. I should go over how to put the stickers on because this is kind of hard sometimes. Logically thinking, there is a cutout for the sticker here. And if you're like me, you would think, oh, the logical way to put this sticker on is to line up the middle part of the cutout with the middle part of the cutout on the sticker. No, for some reason, that just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense at all. But what I do is I line it up with the left side, make sure there's like little to no gap there, make sure it's straight on the top and the bottom, and then I'm a little crooked on the top. That wasn't my best. But yeah, making sure that it's all lined up is hard. Even though I've done this hundreds of times, I still mess up on this. Practice doesn't always make perfect, I guess.